So imagine it. The sun was absolutely blazing outside, turning the city sidewalks into a shimmering ocean of wavy heat lines that danced around the ankles of hurried pedestrians. And inside the county courthouse's marbled corridors, the echo of footsteps reverberated like distant thunder. That day, I was there as a freelance journalist, assigned to observe and take notes on a few local criminal proceedings that might make for an interesting story. Let me tell you, I had no idea I would stumble onto a situation that would not only blow up into a huge local scandal, but would also catapult me into national headlines. I was told by a courthouse clerk that a minor was coming in for a hearing involving some petty theft charges, allegedly shoplifting at a local electronics store. Nothing big. I thought just a routine case. Likely something I wouldn't even bother writing a feature on. But how wrong I was. Because that ordinary case, which basically looked like a silly teenage blunder, turned out to be a massive turning point for both the defendant, this slender, black teenager named Malcolm James, and for the entire justice system in our county, possibly even beyond that. By the time I took my seat, several people in the gallery were whispering that there had been tension between Judge Markham and a few defense attorneys recently, especially in cases involving young black defendants. Some attorneys labeled him harsh, quick to judge, perhaps carrying a certain bias. Yet, the courthouse gossip is just that gossip, so I tried not to form an opinion prematurely. Well, let me tell you, it didn't take more than a few minutes before I witnessed something so brazen, so utterly out of line, that I literally dropped my pen onto my notebook. The hearing began like any other. The bailiff said, "All rise, the Honourable Judge Harold Markham presiding," and we all got on our feet. Markham strolled in with that stern, perpetually frowning face of his, robe meticulously pressed, hair slicked back with precision, as if he believed he was the grand arbiter of right and wrong incarnate. And then I saw the defendant, Malcolm James, a tall but lanky 17-year-old with closely cropped hair, wearing a wrinkled white button-down shirt that looked a size too big and a pair of black slacks. He stood there, hands clasped in front of him, glancing around the room with what could only be described as a mixture of fear and quiet determination. His public defender, Miss Rosenthal, was a woman in her early 40s, short brunette hair, glasses perched precariously on her nose, who had the fatigued look of someone juggling too many cases at once. She placed a supportive hand on Malcolm's shoulder and whispered a few last-second instructions before the proceedings began. "All right, let's get this show on the road," Judge Markham said with an exasperated sigh. "Case number 40,732, the State versus Malcolm James." Counsel approached the bench. A hush fell over the room, and the attorneys walked forward. The judge flipped through some papers, furrowed his brow, and then let out a dismissive grunt. "Prosecution. What are we looking at here? Maximum sentencing guidelines." The prosecutor, a woman named Barker, was middle-aged, with a reputation for being tough but fair. She cleared her throat, her voice echoing in the stillness. "Your Honor, for a minor with no previous record, the state is willing to consider probation and community service, assuming the defendant pleads guilty to the misdemeanor charge. Malcolm has expressed remorse. He wants to finish high school. He's been accepted into a local youth mentorship program." But before she could finish, the judge raised a hand. "Hold on," he said. And then, in a tone dripping with condescension, he turned his gaze to Malcolm, looking him up and down as though he were an insect on a microscope slide. "Son, you must think you're quite special, don't you?" he sneered. Malcolm's eyes widened a little, and he swallowed hard before speaking softly. "No, sir." "Then why?" the judge continued. "Would you be stupid enough to think you could walk into that store, stuff a pair of headphones and a portable charger in your pockets, and just stroll out? Because that's exactly what the arrest report says you did. Did you think the employees wouldn't notice? Or maybe you just assumed that, because of who you are, you can do whatever you please." The gallery shifted uncomfortably. I distinctly heard Miss Rosenthal murmur, "Objection, Your Honor. That's argumentative." But the judge ignored her. Right then and there, the air was sucked out of the room, I actually gasped, and I wasn't alone. Several people in the gallery exchanged horrified glances. Miss Rosenthal froze in disbelief. The prosecutor's jaw dropped slightly, and even the bailiff's eyes darted toward the judge with alarm. But the worst thing was the look on Malcolm's face. It was as though the weight of those words was pressing into his shoulders so heavily that he physically shrank. Miss, if he wants to run around with no discipline, no morals, and no sense of accountability, then the court has a right to lay down some truth. Your Honor, that's enough, Miss. Rosenthal nearly shouted, her face turning red. You're not just implying, this is blatant, racially charged language. Markham shrugged theatrically. Racially charged? And then the judge, with the gallery in utter silent horror, said perhaps the most chilling words of the entire hearing. He smirked, a cold, contemptuous look crossing his face, and said, I don't care if you claim to be the Prince of Wales or the President's nephew. Here, you're nothing but a number, and your colour doesn't grant you any special privileges. No matter who you claim to be or who you really are, you're still just another black kid with a rap sheet. Am I clear? Deafening silence. Malcolm's eyes watered, but he set his jaw and remained stoic. Miss Rosenthal shook her head in disbelief, while the prosecutor seemed too stunned to intervene, uncertain how to salvage the hearing without causing an even bigger scandal. Rosenthal finally said, voice trembling, If you continue in this manner, I will have no choice but to file a motion for recusal and to consider an ethics complaint. This is unacceptable. Judge Markham leaned forward, anger flashing in his eyes. You do what you have to do, counselor, but I'll say one more time to the defendant, you think you're special? You're not. And if you don't learn, you'll be lucky to see the outside world again by the time you're 30. Malcolm took a slow, measured breath, and then, in a voice that resonated with a dignity beyond his years, he whispered, Yes, Your Honor, I understand. But I need you to understand something too. I'm not who you think I am. At that, Markham scoffed. I've heard that line more times than I can count. Now, are we done? Or do I need to have you thrown in juvenile detention for disrespect? Malcolm closed his eyes, as if gathering his courage, and Miss Rosenthal gently touched his shoulder again, stepping in quickly. No, Your Honor. The defense will accept the plea deal for probation and community service, pending a formal sentencing hearing. But I'm placing on record my objection to your remarks. Markham just waved it off, July noted. Now, get this kid out of my courtroom. I've got real criminals to deal with. And with that final remark, real criminals, the hearing was adjourned. The sense of shock in that courtroom was palpable. People stood in subdued horror as the bailiff led Malcolm toward the exit. Miss, I had to talk to them. I had to record their statements. I had to do something. Malcolm, the first said softly as I approached, I'm a journalist. I'd like to, Miss. Rosenthal put up a hand, her eyes weary but still filled with a fierce protectiveness. He's 17. I can't let him speak to you without his legal guardian present. Proceed carefully. The hallway was bustling with attorneys, clerks, and people waiting for their own hearings, but the three of us found a small alcove near a row of vending machines. Malcolm, that was terrible, I began, trying to find words. I'm so sorry you went through that. He nodded. I hesitated, uncertain how to broach the question swirling in my mind. Who was Malcolm James? And why did he keep implying he was more than meets the eye? Finally, I asked, You said you're not who he thinks you are. What did you mean? Malcolm looked down at his shoes, a flush creeping over his cheeks. Because I know exactly who I am. My father died when I was 5. My mum works 2 jobs, and my grandmother raised me. Yes, I made a mistake. I tried to steal some electronics. I was stupid, but I'm not some thug or gangster, and I'm not a nobody. He glanced up at Miss Rosenthal, who offered a gentle nod of encouragement. I'm the nephew of a very important man. You ever heard of Maurice James? My eyes widened. Maurice James was a well-known figure in the city's philanthropic scene, a multi-millionaire entrepreneur who'd invested heavily in educational programs and community centers in underserved neighborhoods. He was constantly featured in local news for funding scholarships, building youth centers, and even assisting re-entry programs for formerly incarcerated people. "That's your uncle?" I whispered, my jaw almost hitting the floor. "Yeah," Malcolm said quietly, "but I never bring it up because I don't want people thinking I'm trying to get special treatment. I wanted to make my own way, but look where that got me. I was stupid to steal, no excuses, but I never expected a judge to treat me like I'm worthless. If my uncle finds out about this, he will find out," Miss Rosenthal interjected, "because I'm going to inform him. We can't let that judge get away with this, not without repercussions." "Malcolm, what the judge said wasn't just inappropriate, it was unethical. You're not the first young black defendant he's lashed out against. But you might be the one who can do something about it." "I just want justice," he finally said, eyes glistening. "Not just for me, but for every other kid who stands in front of him and gets torn apart like that." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my own racing thoughts. "Malcolm," the first said, "I'm going to write about this. If you're okay with it, I want the world to know what happened in that courtroom. But you're absolutely right that this needs to come to light. The system isn't supposed to humiliate people, it's supposed to find justice." And Markham's remarks were more than a slip, they were a window into his prejudices. Over the next few days, I dug deep. I interviewed courthouse staff, other defense lawyers, even some former defendants who had faced Markham. A pattern emerged. People of color, particularly black defendants, were often treated to these disdainful remarks, though never quite as overtly racist as what we'd witnessed with Malcolm. Some attorneys said they'd considered filing complaints, but feared retaliation for their clients. A few had quietly tried to recuse Markham from certain cases. Every interview fueled my determination to expose this story. Meanwhile, Miss Rosenthal had indeed contacted Malcolm's mother and his uncle, Maurice James. She set up a meeting where I was invited to attend. We gathered in Miss Rosenthal's modest office. A few plastic chairs, a cluttered desk, and shelves crammed with law books. Maurice James arrived in a sleek black suit, exuding the quiet confidence of a self-made success. He embraced Malcolm, concern etched in his features. "Why didn't you tell me, kiddo?" he asked gently. Malcolm stared at the floor. "I was ashamed. I messed up." Maurice placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder. "Everybody messes up. It doesn't give that judge the right to dehumanize you." Miss Rosenthal cleared her throat. "Mr. James, thank you for coming. I know you have a lot of influence in the community. This could become a pivotal case in holding Judge Markham accountable for his conduct." Maurice's jaw tightened. "I've heard rumors about Markham's bias before, but I never had proof. Now, with Malcolm's case, we have direct courtroom testimony about his remarks. I'm ready to stand behind Malcolm in any legal or ethical battle that needs to happen." He turned to me. "You're a journalist, right? You're going to break this story." My heart was pounding. "Yes, sir," I said. "I'm going to break it wide open, with or without the major outlets. But if we can get them on board, they'll get on board," Maurice said with a determined nod. "I can help with that. I've got a few connections." Over the next week, I wrote a lengthy piece detailing Malcolm's hearing, quoting transcripts I had obtained, including lines from Markham's hateful tirade. I interviewed Miss. Headlines blared, "Judge under fire for racially charged tirade. Local teen speaks out against biased judge." And, of course, the sensational angle, "Judge mocked black teen in court. But do you know who he really is?" Referencing Malcolm's connection to Maurice James. It became the talk of the city, trending on social media, spurring outraged editorials, and prompting local civil rights groups to rally. The phone in Miss Rosenthal's office rang non-stop, and my own inbox was flooded with tips from other defendants who said they wanted to speak out about Markham. The day of the sentencing arrived, and the courthouse was besieged by reporters, activists, and curious onlookers who'd heard about the case. There were signs demanding Markham's resignation, chanting crowds calling for justice, and a heavy police presence trying to maintain order. Malcolm arrived with his mother and grandmother, both wearing expressions of worry and determination. Maurice James stood protectively by their side, stoic, his gaze flicking across the throng of cameras. I managed to weave through the crowd and meet them near the main entrance. "Malcolm," I asked, "are you ready for this?" He shrugged, looking both tired and resolute. "I just want to get this over with. I know what I did was wrong. I'm ready to take whatever sentence I deserve. But I refuse to be humiliated by that man again." We filed into the courtroom, which was packed, every seat taken, people standing in the back, cameras not allowed inside but reporters scribbling notes feverishly. Markham walked in with a scowl, glaring at the gallery like we were all intruders on his fiefdom. "Order in the court," the bailiff intoned, though the tension was so thick you could slice it with a knife. Miss Rosenthal and the prosecutor stood before the bench, with Malcolm standing quietly beside Miss Rosenthal, eyes forward. Markham cleared his throat. "Let's skip the pageantry and get straight to business," he grumbled. "Mr. James, you've accepted responsibility for theft of property valued at $126, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Malcolm replied. "The recommended sentence from the state," Markham continued, "is probation and community service. Now, ordinarily, I'd follow that, but given the recent media circus, I can't help but wonder if you're truly remorseful or just playing a part for the cameras." Miss Rosenthal bristled. "Your Honor, as we've discussed, there's a motion to recuse you from this case. We believe the remarks you made have compromised your impartiality." Markham exhaled loudly, his nostrils flaring. "I'm well aware of your motion. I deny it. I see no conflict in my rendering a sentence here." "That is unconscionable," Miss Rosenthal shot back. "The entire city knows what you said to Malcolm. If you won't recuse yourself, I'll request an immediate emergency hearing with the Judicial Conduct Board." Markham slammed his gavel. "Watch your tone, counselor. This is my courtroom." In that moment, an unexpected voice rose from the gallery. "Not for long!" someone shouted. A smattering of agreement rippled through the crowd. Markham's face turned beet red, but he composed himself after a moment. "Court security. Remove anyone who can't keep quiet." People fell silent. Then Markham leaned forward, fixing Malcolm with a piercing glare. "You stand here, the center of attention, acting like the victim. But I'm the one the public is crucifying because I dared to speak the truth. Fine. I'll give you your probation, your community service. Let's see if you learn anything from this, or if you'll be back in here in 6 months." Miss Rosenthal clenched her jaw. "We accept the sentence, but we're not done fighting this, Your Honor. We plan on seeing you in front of the conduct board." Markham made a derisive sound at the back of his throat, then pounded his gavel. "Court is adjourned. Next case." And just like that, it was over for the moment. Malcolm had received probation and community service, which, ironically, was the original outcome that everyone expected. But the bigger story was the unmasking of Markham's blatant bias, an uproar that was not going to die down. As we all exited the courtroom, a throng of reporters enveloped Malcolm and his family. Maurice James held up a hand, addressing them. "I'm grateful that Malcolm won't have to serve jail time, but my nephew's experience has exposed something vile in our justice system. We're filing a formal complaint, and we urge all others who've been mistreated to come forward. This is just the beginning." The following weeks were a whirlwind of developments. The Judicial Conduct Board accelerated its investigation due to intense public scrutiny. Old case files of Markham's were dragged into the spotlight, revealing a pattern of disproportionately harsh sentences against black and brown defendants, accompanied by transcripts that hinted at him making borderline racist remarks. The local bar association joined forces with civil rights groups to demand Markham be suspended pending the investigation. And then came the subpoena. Markham was ordered to appear before the board to answer for his conduct. During this time, I spoke with Malcolm frequently, checking in on him for updates. He was fulfilling his community service hours at a local youth center, ironically one that his uncle helped fund. He was painting walls, organizing books, and tutoring younger kids in math, a subject he excelled at. "You know," He told me one afternoon, as we sat on a bench outside the youth centre, "I'm actually thankful for this. I mean, not for what Markham said, but for what it sparked in me. I messed up, and I'll never do something that's stupid again. But now, I want to help other kids who might be going down the wrong path, and it's given me a purpose." I nodded, feeling a surge of admiration. "You've handled this with more grace than most adults would." He smiled shyly, then turned serious. "I hope he gets what he deserves. Not because I hate him, but because it's not right for a man like that to wield so much power. How many people's lives has he messed up? We're about to find out," I said. The next big turning point was the hearing before the Judicial Conduct Board. It was closed to the general public, but some key witnesses were allowed in, including Miss Rosenthal and, by special arrangement, Malcolm himself. Markham stood before a panel of 5 members judges, attorneys, and a community representative facing questions about the transcripts and the allegations. Word had leaked that Markham intended to vigorously defend himself, claiming his remarks were taken out of context, or that he was merely trying to scare the defendant straight. However, as testimonies piled on both from attorneys and from former defendants, the pattern became undeniable. Attorneys recounted how Markham belittled clients in racially charged ways, used dog whistle phrases, and applied sentences that seemed disproportionately punitive to black defendants. A young man testified that Markham told him, "Your people never learn," when sentencing him for a non-violent offense. Another spoke about how Markham once threatened to ship him back to where he came from, even though he was born in the United States. The board members looked increasingly grim as the testimonies went on. Then it was Malcolm's turn to speak. With Miss Rosenthal at his side, he recounted every word Markham had said to him in that initial hearing, his voice cracking at times, but never losing composure. He spoke about how he felt worthless, how he felt singled out because of his race, and how the trauma of that experience had haunted him. He finished by saying, "If he's allowed to stay on the bench, I'm afraid for the next kid who comes in there. I don't want anyone else to feel that kind of humiliation. We deserve fairness and respect, no matter our color, no matter our mistakes." The effect on the panel was profound. The lead member, a senior judge with decades of experience, cleared his throat and thanked Malcolm for his testimony. Markham, for his part, tried to rebut, stammering about how his words were twisted, how he was only addressing what he saw as a pattern in certain communities. But each time he opened his mouth, it seemed to dig him deeper. After 2 days of proceedings, the board announced its decision. Markham was to be suspended immediately, pending further investigation, with a strong recommendation that he be removed from the bench permanently. The news spread like wildfire. For many in the community, it felt like a victory not just for Malcolm but for everyone who'd been subjected to Markham's bias. A wave of relief and celebration rippled through local activist circles, and even among the attorneys who had long fought Markham. Yet, the judge's allies claimed he was being sacrificed for political correctness. Some local politicians grumbled that the media frenzy had railroaded a man who was tough on crime, but the momentum was overwhelming, and Markham soon resigned, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the real reason. As soon as he stepped down, he slipped from the public eye, likely facing further consequences from the Ethics Commission, including a potential permanent disbarment. That's when the letters started pouring in, letters and emails and phone calls to Malcolm, Miss Rosenthal, and even me. Some were from families thanking Malcolm for his courage, others from young people inspired by how he'd turned a painful experience into a catalyst for change. They said that Malcolm's story had given them hope that they, too, could stand up against injustice. Donations to local youth programs soared in the wake of the publicity. At Miss Rosenthal's suggestion, and with the help of Maurice James Malcolm, started volunteering as a peer counselor for at-risk youth, teaching them about knowing their rights and avoiding the pitfalls he'd encountered. The petty theft charge still stood on Malcolm's record, at least temporarily, but Miss Rosenthal was optimistic they could get it expunged once he successfully completed his probation. Whenever I saw him at the youth center, painting walls or handing out pamphlets on educational programs, he wore the look of someone who'd found a mission bigger than himself. 6 months later, I arranged a follow-up interview. By then, life in the city had returned to a semblance of normal, but Markham's story was still occasionally referenced. Whenever discussions about judicial reform came up, Malcolm had grown a bit taller, his shoulders broader, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence. I met him at a little cafe near the youth center, and I asked him how he felt, looking back on everything that happened. He sipped his iced tea thoughtfully. I feel proud in a way, though I know I never should have tried to steal in the first place. But if that mistake hadn't happened, maybe Markham would still be doing what he did, hurting people in his courtroom. Now, people know, and maybe judges like him will think twice before degrading someone based on their race. I nodded, recording his words. What do you want to do next? He smiled. Graduate high school with good grades. Hopefully go to college, maybe criminal justice or social work or law. I'm still figuring it out. But I know I want to help people. If my experience can be a lesson, then at least something good came out of it. As we sat there, an older gentleman approached, hesitantly extending a hand. You're Malcolm James, right? He asked. Malcolm nodded, a bit taken aback. The man smiled. I just wanted to say thank you. My grandson went through Markham's court a while back, and he said it was horrible. We never had the courage to speak up. You did. You're a brave young man. Malcolm, visibly touched, shook the man's hand. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. When the man left, I noticed a hint of moisture in Malcolm's eyes. Stuff like that keeps happening, he admitted. People recognizing me, thanking me. It's weird, but it also makes me feel like I did something worthwhile. I couldn't help but grin. You did. Trust me, you did. So that's the story. From the jaw-dropping moment a biased judge decided to mock a black teen in court, to the discovery that this so-called nobody was actually the nephew of one of the city's most influential philanthropists, to the cascade of events that forced that judge off the bench. It's a story about injustice, yes, but also about courage, redemption, and the power of exposing wrongdoing. Malcolm James, who once stood trembling in that courtroom, subject to hateful remarks, is now a voice of resilience and activism in our city. He's the living embodiment of the principle that no matter who you are, whether you're the most vulnerable kid on the block or related to the biggest name in town, you deserve fairness, you deserve dignity, and you have the right to stand up and fight back against those who would deny you that. And that, I think, is the real lesson here, sometimes. Change starts with a single moment of cruelty laid bare, a single person saying, enough. And from that spark, an entire community can rally, shining a spotlight on a long, festering darkness. It's not just about one judge, or one teen, or one case of shoplifting. It's about a system, and what happens when that system fails one person so spectacularly that it can no longer ignore its own deep flaws. If you ask me, but do you know who he really is? The answer goes far beyond being the nephew of Maurice James. He's a symbol of how one person, even a teenager who made a mistake, can bring down a powerful, prejudiced figure and ignite a wave of change that resonates far beyond the walls of any one courtroom.